These are the faces of women who have come to represent progress.
Rwanda has led the world in the levels of women in its parliament now for over a decade.
Nearly 2/3 of Rwanda's parliament is made up of women. That's more than twice the global average.
Countries that have more women in power tend to have better outcomes for development. So better outcomes for child mortality, better outcomes for education. Countries that have higher levels of women in their government, and also just general better levels of gender equality more broadly, are more likely to be stable and secure.
But the origins of Rwanda's high female representation stem from the country's darkest moment.
Women must know that things have changed. We can equally do what men can do.
The whole world now wants to learn from Rwanda about gender, about women in Rwanda, how are they developing, what are they achieving.
While Rwanda leads the world in female representation, the motivations of the ruling party have raised questions about the true extent of women's power. In April 1994, Rwandan President Juvenal Habyarimana was killed when his plane was shot down near the country's capital, Kigali. The assassination ignited ethnic tensions between the majority Hutu and the minority Tutsi tribes.
In 100 days of hatred, 800,000 died.
The violence would leave 1/10 of the population dead. While the conflict was undoubtedly framed by ethnicity, its effect on women was undeniable.
The genocide was planned, not just killing, but other things. Rape was a reward the leaders gave to those who killed.
Most women had been gang raped. That was very traumatic. So many of them were mutilated. The women were targeted because of who they were. And it shocked the world to see that even your own husband, whom you have given beautiful children, turns around and slaughters you because you belong to that ethnic group.
Many others were, disconnected and kind of separated from their children, from their families.
In spite of this horror, it was women who would rebuild the country.
It is now among the most stable countries in Africa. Average incomes have tripled. Education, healthcare, tourism, and trade are all improving dramatically.
Rwandan leader Paul Kagame has been assailed by international observers for suppressing political opponents and dissent, sometimes violently. But he and his ruling party, the RPF, have also been praised for stabilizing the country and setting it on a course of recovery. Part of this redevelopment was enabling Rwandan women who had found themselves taking on new roles that had traditionally belonged to men, burying the dead, building homes, as well as housing 500,000 orphans.
I'm always thinking of stories that women have told me over the years about how before the genocide, they were a housewife and they were living sort of, kind of day to day, raising children, cooking, caring for their plot of land, and how in the aftermath of the violence, they found themselves alone and completely realizing that they needed to act, they needed to pull people together, they needed to do something to be able to survive the utterly abysmal and horrible conditions of life, especially in rural communities in the aftermath of the bloodshed. Land has gone fallow, massive displacement. I mean, about 50% of the population was displaced from their homes. And so you see a total erosion of social networks. You no longer have your community to be with. You have to forge new networks and forge new ways of providing for yourself and for your children and for others in your community.
Just a few years after the violence, women had formed an estimated 15,400 organizations across the country, initially with a focus on grief, trauma, and support. Mary Balokongeri founded the Rwanda Women's Network.
In where our safe space we could meet and cry, talk about our challenges, talk about issues that really concern us, but at the same time, ask ourselves, what should we do? So out of that safe space, women have learned to plan, to organize, to take awareness to their fellow women, and eventually to connect the whole thinking to the whole political thinking of the country. And in that journey of safety has given us the power to know that you can change a society.
Some of these organizations would evolve into vocational training and profit-making businesses. By joining together and formalizing their structure, groups could become eligible for economic benefits from NGOs or the government.
In the process of formalizing, they established a president, a vice president, a secretary, a treasurer, and this provided really a kind of a platform for women's leadership within these really nascent, small community organizations that then women could use to kind of support their increased engagement in politics.
This increasing engagement of women in what had been a typical patriarchy would have a broader social impact. From the clothes they wore to the businesses they started to run, ideas of what women should be were about to change.
When you look back before the colonial era, definitely women were very active but yet invisible. And that's the typical patriarchal society that most African countries are. Patriarchy is a very hard system to undo. It takes courage, it takes time, because it is culturally grounded.
To begin undoing this system, there was one aspect of Rwandan society that needed to change quickly: land rights. With more than 90% of Rwandans dependent on agriculture for their livelihood, access was vital in the recovery. Women's organizations mobilized to take control of land owned by deceased family members. In 1999, the succession law was passed, granting women the right to inherit land and property for the first time. This would set the stage for subsequent legislation that established children's rights and protection against gender-based violence.
At the time, the inheritance laws were not there, and so we had to fight for it in order to make sure that women are able to inherit their husbands' properties. We want to be able to forcefully put forward the women's needs, because women's needs are not men's needs. And nobody will talk about women's needs better than you as a woman.
With just 20 judges left alive after the genocide, more women also became involved in gacaca courts, village-based justice proceedings designed to try hundreds of thousands accused of crimes during the genocide. By 2001, about 35% of newly elected gacaca judges were women. Then, in August 2003, a new constitution was written. As well as committing to fight the ideology of genocide and eradicate ethnic divisions, the constitution also pursues gender equality. It states that women are granted at least 30% of posts in decision-making organs. Research shows that 30% is the critical mass of women in power needed to make a substantial difference in politics. In Rwanda, those seats are elected by voters from local women's councils, but women are also able to contest seats outside of this allocation. In the first election after the genocide, women won 48% of seats.
This really was, I think, evidence of a broader swell of support, both kind of from the political leadership as well as from the grassroots, for women's political participation in this sort of new rebuilding Rwanda. That those sort of informal grassroots self-help projects became the foundation for building a more engaged kind of political kind of population of women.
The narrative has changed. Before it was only a male-dominated space, but now we are together in it. So the more we continue to engage ourselves with them, and the more we continue to reason with them. And that's why we said the narrative is changing. and it has changed for good.
By the next election in 2013, the number of women elected rose to 64%. Led by Paul Kagame, the ruling party, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, has made women's inclusion a hallmark of its program for post-genocide recovery and reconstruction. But despite the significant steps in female empowerment and broader development following the genocide, human rights advocates are highly critical of the way in which Kagame's party runs the country. Freedom House ranks Rwanda as not free, with concern about rights and liberties. Human Rights Watch says the government displays a marked intolerance of the most basic forms of dissent.
Amnesty International wrote a report in the lead up to the 2017 election that talks about opposition politicians, journalists, human rights defenders being jailed, physically attacked, even killed.
I think it's rubbish, absolute rubbish.
You reject
Rwanda
that?
is completely different from what it was 25 years ago.
And although the RPF welcomed women into politics, critics suggest the motives aren't as noble as once thought. Women, who were seen as less complicit in the genocide, could be used to the party's advantage.
Many of the boldest and most kind of fierce leaders within civil society were brought into government so that they could be, I think, greater kind of policed in a way that is really has been detrimental for the kind of growth of democracy in Rwanda. I think the notable thing about the women's seats is that they are not affiliated with a political party. So they are just women's seats. And so critics have really suggested that this has allowed the Rwandan Patriotic Front to cement an even greater political control over the parliament, because while the number of seats held by RPF members is whatever it is, the number of seats that are held by RPF kind of supporters and you know, those closely affiliated with the party are often on the women's tickets, and so they're not actually recorded as being a member of a political party while they're in office. When we look at the cases of Diane Rwigara or Victoire Ingabire, these are two women that have dared to challenge President Kagame for the presidency, and both were met with extreme sanctions. They were thrown in jail. I think those cases are really illustrative in showing the limits of the story of women's empowerment in Rwanda. We do see these kind of amazing levels of women in government, but at the same time, what power does a parliament have if they are completely under the control of the executive? Women have power to the extent that what they're interested in and working on does not conflict with the goals of the regime. So there have been some kind of notable, I think, pieces of legislation, especially around gender-based violence, that women parliamentarians in Rwanda have pushed forward, and which have made important, impressive sort of legislative change in the country.
Despite this legislation, levels of violence against women remain high. Estimates in 2010 found 41% of women have experienced some form of physical violence since the age of 15, rising to 56% for married women.
We see really the challenge in assuming that women's political empowerment translates or trickles down to women's empowerment writ large, right? We see remarkably high rates of gender-based violence, of intimate partner violence. We see remarkably high rates of women's economic disenfranchisement. The story on Rwanda tends to be quite polarized. Just 25 years after absolutely catastrophic and horrific violence, you see a country that hasn't seen a return to bloodshed. You see a country where there have been profound increases in longevity, in health, in education, you know, and that story is one of that really should be celebrated and commended. And then on the other hand, this authoritarian state that has completely jeopardized its population's well-being by shutting down dissent, by conducting widespread extrajudicial killings. These two stories are mutually compatible. They are both true. And I think the reality is that Rwanda's developmental progress has been made possible by its authoritarian nature, right? Rwanda's success in terms of not having another outbreak of violence has been possible because of its massively robust military and security apparatus.
Some of the gains women have made are undermined by the authoritarian nature of the state. Disproportionate numbers of wealthy, foreign-born Tutsi women sit at the top of the table, which means new forms of inequality are developing in Rwanda, impacting the incredible progress women made in the immediate aftermath of the violence. Rwanda leads the world when it comes to the number of women in power, but it's only one part of the bigger picture of equality.
For me, the real lesson of Rwanda is that getting women into politics is only one of many things we must do to actually, increase women's power and, more importantly, dismantle forms of oppression against women. If the level of women in government is not matched by a corresponding kind of strong women's movement rooted in civil society, then the women in government are almost always going to be tokenized. That sort of corresponding need for women in government and kind of the restructuring of the economy, of kind of the kind of patriarchal roots of the family and of society, and of changing kind of the systems of governance as well. Like, that's the way that we build a more gender equal future.
This process we are going through as a country, I call it a rebirth. I must say that Rwanda, when you compare it to other African countries, we are definitely fortunate because we have a system that responds to the needs of women. So we keep reminding ourselves that we worked for it and we deserve it. We are now saying we need to raise our sons and daughters differently. We've come to understand because we have enjoyed the new opportunities that the new Rwanda offers, and doing what is undoable. It's tough. Let's continue, but at the same time, make sure that the generation to come sees things differently.